So I took some tears off my eyes and I put it on his forehead.
Listening to Let Your Voice Be Heard.
It's a logical fallacy, and I know that, but, as always, and maybe the rest of the panel can tell you, I play a bit of the devil's advocate because I am the lone black Republican up here.
He just made a fool out of himself. I mean, you can look at Dennis Rodman and think he's making a fool out of himself.
We know Barack Obama, what he was like, anti-war, government...
Boy, that escalated quickly.
I got to jump into a rally to save a hospital here in Brooklyn in just a minute.
I stopped working on my dissertation the second my grandmother died.
I am a blazing liberal who can have a Republican-leaning ideology if you give me enough beers.
No, I got to get you that Illuminati thesaurus. Once you get that, you're going to be able to speak in the same language I can speak.
Now, a white person with a criminal record is more likely to get a job than a black person without one.
What? Did we just become best friends? Yup!
The point of financial stability and economic justice is that you're free from confines of society and you have more freedom and to make your own choices.
Just in general, people who have money tend to have more access to resources to be able to use in their defense versus people that don't have money. So you see a lot of, lower, and that's really a class issue, and race does come into play.
This is Let Your Voice Be Heard, right here on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. And we are back. This is Let Your Voice Be Heard. And this is Selena Hill on the ones and twos because Stanley left us. He's in Washington, D.C. He'll be back next Sunday. So you can tweet him or you can boo at him on Twitter. I think I just heard one boo. Do that on Twitter.
What is he on now? Cat Daddy something or Fritz Daddy?
I gotta he's not Dark Swindle anymore?
Dark Skin? No, he's back to Dark Skin Swindle.
No, he's not, guys.
Oh, so he's on that Cat Daddy 99 thing.
All right, so on Twitter, it's Stan Fritz, but on Instagram, it's Dark Skin Swindle or Cat Daddy or
one of his multiple
he has like split personalities on social media or something like that. But I do want to start the segment. I want to give a brief debriefing on what's been going on with the torture report, and then we'll just jump straight into this conversation. And again, you can let your voice be heard. The number is 212-650-6903. We have an excellent panel up here. I'm so glad to see you guys, and I definitely want to get your opinion. So just in case you weren't paying as much attention and you only heard like the gruesome parts of what the U.S. has been doing when it comes to torture, it was the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence that recently released a controversial report citing findings of torture by the CIA during the detention and interrogation of many Muslim terrorist suspects after 9/11. So this started to occur after 9/11 in 2001, and we know after terrorist attacks, like all hell broke through. We had this quote unquote war on terror, and all of a sudden they implemented this program to they didn't use the word torture people, but basically to extract information about our enemies, right? So the report found that some interrogations were much more brutal than the CIA had actually disclosed, and that officials misled the Bush administration, which authorized the program, as well as members of Congress and the public. So the interrogations also produced false information, ensnaring innocent people, and sometimes with tragic results. Besides waterboarding, pushing and shoving, what the people did was they also threatened detainees with sexual abuse by shoving broomsticks up their anuses, and rectal hydration, in which they put water up people's rectums. And they would do this sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. And it always made me question, like, if you're not getting the correct information after you do this process the first time, why do it 8 more times or 80 more times?
Want to add to that. On top of the ones that Selena mentioned, you had what's called an attention grasp, walling, which is shoving somebody into the wall, facial slaps, insulting slaps, cramped confinement, wall standing, stress position, sleep deprivation for over 180 hours, insects placed into small confinement boxes, and as Selena already mentioned, the rectal rehydration and waterboarding.
And feeding.
Yes.
And feeding, yes.
Definitely. So the CIA, they said that that the Bush administration told them to implement this quote-unquote enhanced interrogation. But, of course, the Bush administration is pushing back saying, we didn't know as much. Now it's all coming out. I don't know how much I believe that. But I want to just say, torture is immoral. It violates the law and it produces false leads. And that's been pretty much the general consensus. That's what most experts have come to agree upon. So I want to first I want to just let everybody know how torture works. I think I mentioned it in the beginning of the show, but it's when you inflict pain upon a person, and that eventually leads to them saying virtually anything to make the pain stop, and that's how we get so much misinformation. So guys, What was your reaction? Like, who wants to just jump in there and talk about their reaction to this report when it came out? Carlos?
I mean, I wasn't shocked at all. Unfortunately, this is something that I felt that everybody knew already. But then again, we live kind of like in this microcosm here in New York City. Like, this is a liberal bastion. Everybody kind of already has a critical point of view of the Bush years and the Audis. But what shocked me the most was the reaction from everybody else. I'm also shocked by the reaction of certain politicians who are making a calculation in 2016. Hillary Clinton didn't mention anything. Rand Paul, who's supposed to be the ultra-libertarian, civil liberties guy, hasn't said anything. They're all basically washing their hands because I believe that it is in their opinion, and I think that's opinion in this country, that during a time of war, there has to be the country has to have every availability in its arsenal to be able to get information, and apply its dominance over any other country or any other who they feel is a threat to the nation.
Right, and the problem is when you implement tactics that end up having people just give you information, whether it's incorrect or whether it's correct, just for the purposes of getting them to stop, and then you end up with bad information or misinformation, and then you find that it's not helpful. A big part of this is that prior to the instigation, I guess, and the use of these enhanced interrogation techniques, they were already getting good information and credible information at that. And then they started to find that after these techniques were used, I mean, they did get some credible information, but a lot of the information they were getting was not credible. But just to add to your initial point about your reaction and the question that Selena posed, which was, I was not surprised either by the use of the techniques. I mean, I think a lot of people were aware. What I was surprised most about is sort of some of the techniques that I didn't know about, some of the more what I would find stuff to be disgusting, some stuff that disgusts me, that it was done in the name of this country that I live in, that is supposed to, and especially with the idea of civil liberties and, freedom and, not wanting to have an overreaching authoritarian government, and then to subject other people to that. And I realize there's credence to the argument that you have to do what you have to do in time of war, but I just don't buy that. The idea that you need to put people in totally inhumane situations and treat them like animals and take away their humanity.
Well, Jason, I know you're a military expert. Is torture ever justifiable? I mean, you worked in the military and you saw how much pressure our officials were when it came to finding our enemies. The whole country was on edge, and we were all like a lot of us were like, let's go to war. Many people voted for Bush to go on the ground in Iraq and start the war. And that was the sentiment of the country at the time. So is this something that was justifiable?
Well, I won't say that it's justifiable. And I thank you for giving me the accolade of expert. But, I spent my time. I did my time. I mean, I'm a veteran of the war on terror. That's public knowledge. Anyone can find that out about me. In the sense of, is torture justifiable? No, whether from a moral or legal perspective, I'm not going to even give credence to the idea that it's justifiable. However, what people may not be aware of, that in the United States military, particularly in the United States Army, there are interrogation techniques. I mean, if some of you may have followed the articles in, I believe, the New York Times and the Washington Post, where there were statements made, well, as long as the techniques didn't deviate from the Army field manual on interrogation techniques, it was fine. Because there is a field manual. It exists. There is something that allows you to exhibit and to implement these particular type of techniques on individuals in times of dire need. So I listened to the panel when we're saying that some of the information is not good information. You're absolutely right. But sometimes the information is good information.
Okay.
Now the issue here is when and how can you apply these techniques, and then whether the techniques in question that were utilized under the report that are cited by the report fall within that category of permitted and usable techniques. And obviously, no, for the most part.
Jason, not to cut you off, but what defines dire need?
Dire need would be, from what I recall, immediate risk to the lives.
It's like the bomb on the plane situation, right?
Very much so. If you knew that there was an imminent attack on a civilian or even a military target within 12 to 24 hours, and one person that you happen to have captured had intimate knowledge about that, I'm sure that it would have been permitted to utilize certain techniques. But once again, rectal rehydration, what were the other rather gruesome techniques? There were
Like
insects in confined
holding
spaces.
a drill next to somebody's
body.
From
what I can remember of that particular manual, and I did have that manual at some point. No, those were never things. But the shoving, the hitting, the sleep deprivation, things like that. There were training courses that I myself took that required 48 to 72 hours of sleep deprivation and what would be considered starvation because you were only allowed to consume maybe about 800 calories to 1,000 calories. You could imagine that for a grown man. At that point, your sense of logic, your sense of cognition is completely delayed. So, what really surprises me, honestly, that you guys as civilians were comfortable with it. I'm comfortable with it because I understood what it was. I'm comfortable with it because I was in the military. I am a veteran. That the common American civilian, though, really the only thing that, and from my view, that seems to upset most Americans is the fact you guys just didn't know the severity of the techniques.
Right.
But I think we've come to the point where we're comfortable with it because we're desynthesized by it. At this point,
right.
we do,
and that frightens me. That I tell you, Carlos, why it scares me because I don't make nearly the same comparison, but this is extremely reminiscent of what Germans said after World War II.
Right,
we didn't know how bad it was. We thought they were work camps. Buchenwald was a work camp. We thought Dachau was a work camp.
I just want to actually bring it back. There's two things that I want to say. There's one point that you just made about the compartmentalization of what people know and kind of how that played into World War II. It's actually a conversation I was having with my mom yesterday about the police department and about how if you're a police officer and you know somebody in your ranks is doing something, that would be violating the police manual and you don't say anything, that you're just as complicit. And it's kind of like the same thing here. If you know that people are doing things that go beyond what the field manual allows. I mean, listen, if we're smacking somebody in the face to try and get information in a war, I don't see
I
that
don't
as
think
being
that even violates.
torture.
That probably doesn't violate as torture.
But when you're doing things that are blatantly in violation of UN torture conventions that we've signed, and it's basically flipping the bird to the international community. I mean, and nobody really takes, I guess, international law that seriously as it is, but it's basically
the United States sits in the Security Council. Anything that goes through in the Security Council that would actually form an investigation in the United States gets blocked.
Exactly.
And vetoed. The problem really goes down to the fact that under our own parameters, because we were one of the main people, one of the main actors that initiated the Geneva Conventions. We were one of the main actors that set up the United Nations or any kind of body that would be able to check and balance this kind of a tactic. We have in power people who are able to manipulate or able to stipulate an argument very adequately that we are using necessary and justifiable means after we were attacked.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's what justified our tactics. After 9/11, we did not care about what we were going to do. We just wanted to act.
And I just wanted to bring up the point that even General David Petraeus said that the best way to extract information from somebody is from befriending them. Mm-hmm. So again, that just plays into the point. Why did we resort to this method?
And I'll jump in on that. That's absolutely right. The best type of intelligence is what's called human intelligence. But the problem with human intelligence from a practicality situation, it takes time to develop them. Okay. It requires you to learn the culture, learn the languages, ingratiate yourself, and implant yourself in those areas of the world where you're going to get that real-time human intelligence that's actionable. Now, one thing I can tell you, having served in the military for quite some time, we have a real dearth of people who have the cultural knowledge and wherewithal as well as the linguistic skills in order to actually get that real-time intelligence. So that explains why we may have depended more strongly on the torture techniques or the enhanced interrogation techniques, because we really do not have, maybe now, I don't know, I've been out for quite a few years, but at the time during 2003 through 2008, I can tell you we did not have many people who could speak Farsi or even Arabic or even understand the nuances of what was being communicated to you in Iraqi tribal society, as far as making alliances in order to fight against more extremist Islamic contingents within the country. Those type of issues are what I'm talking about.
Do you think that's... I'm sorry.
I was going to say, there's something that you mentioned before that I think we keep skipping over, but we should really talk about, which is you keep mentioning the military. Yeah. But what a lot of these enhanced interrogation techniques were not carried out by the military.
Central intelligence.
They were carried out by the CIA.
Central intelligence.
And that raises another bigger question, which is even if it was arguably, and I'm not saying I agree with this, but even if arguably the military field manual says that some of these techniques are appropriate and are not torture, is it than crossing a line when you have the CIA, which is supposed to be an intelligence agency that is supposed to be, yes, collecting intelligence, but now they're engaging in military type techniques. And so then we have an issue with that about separation of powers and about war powers and who is in the appropriate position to be carrying these things out. I was going to jump in,
and then I'm going to keep this segment brief. So, this component of what I'm going to say brief because I know we have to keep the panel flowing. There has never been a real separation. I understand there's a legal separation, but from the origins of the Central Intelligence Agency, if we look back historically, it came out of the United States Army. Mm-hmm. It's many of the people who serve in it now have military experience. Heck, one of the most recent secretaries of defense, I think it was perhaps Robert Gates, I could be wrong, dually served in the U.S. Air Force at the same time that he was in the CIA. That's a little known thing that many people may not understand, and I don't think I'm divulging too much. You can serve in the clandestine service of the CIA at the same time still actively in the U.S. military. So that's if I continuously bring it up, it's just because it's extremely difficult to make the delineation between what, especially if some of this stuff was done under the auspices of Guantanamo Bay, what fell under the auspices of the United States military and what was under the actions of the Central Intelligence Agency.
The reason I raise this point is because there's a Mother Jones article on this in more detail, but one of the things that's striking about the report is that it reveals that some, not all, but some of the CIA interrogators were untrained. They were completely untrained in these enhanced interrogation techniques or in any techniques, and that essentially they made up torturous techniques as they went along, just by pulling rabbits out of a hat. I don't know. Whereas if you have a military that actually is trained and they know the difference between what crosses the line or when something crosses the line, then they're in a better position, or we're in a better position as Americans to say, okay, our military carried something out and they were trained to do it and they knew where the line was. And some people will get in a disagreement about where that line actually is. But assuming we say there's a line here and on one side of it is torture and on the other side isn't, and our military is properly trained to know where that line is, versus some people in the CIA, those who are not overlapping, who are just making things up as they go along, they're not trained to know where that line is, and so they often will cross it.
Right. I'm not a proponent for the draft. I never believe that military service necessarily is adequate to the well-being of someone's health or even someone's mental health. But I do think that, when it comes to experience and when it comes to a certain level of even duty for the country, there needs to be some kind of a way where we can actually get better personnel or even more adequate personnel. So that's actually kind of something I want to drive out to Jason, because you've been in the military and you mentioned something that actually kind of caught my eye a little bit, which is there are people that went to the military in 2003 and 2004 who did not have the adequate educational background to insert themselves in a culture. And my question to you is, do you think that we need to have some kind of draft or some kind of like service in which we can teach people before they go into the military or go into military service?
I do understand, and I know that's something that I do want to answer, but I believe that we will be transitioning over to a break right now. But as soon as we get back, absolutely we'll address that, because there are some far more nuanced reasons for why that needs, both in the CIA and the U.S. military.
And if I tip a bit with it ain't no discussion. It costs to beat up boss, my nigga, you way out of your budget.
And we are back. So before we went to break, Carlos had posed a question regarding the military to Jason. Jason,
absolutely.
Did you respond
I'm ready
to that question?
Make definitely a quick response
just
to
kind
that.
Of reframe.
Sure, just to reframe. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think we need to have some kind of mandatory service to have more better trained personnel going into our military and our intelligence community?
Absolutely. Well, as far as the military, absolutely. I believe that one of the best periods of this country came out of the fact that there was a shared burden in national service. One of the ways that we so easily got into the Iraq War was because it was not a conflict that was borne by the entire country the way that the Vietnam War was. You know, the post-Vietnam military is really, the result of an economic draft, for lack of better terms. However, with intelligence community recruiting is extremely different from that. Mm-hmm. It's targeted. It's usually at some of the best institutions in this country, and it's funneled in a very targeted way. What is lacking, though, is once again the development of those carefully shepherded contacts in those societies, in those cultures, which could potentially be grounds for a threat to us. And and learning and cultivating those contacts in those cultures. So there's no quick way to do that.
Right. Essentially, it's the development of
it's
trust,
development of
and trust
yeah.
takes
there's
time
no
to
fast
develop.
way to do that.
Right. So we actually have a caller on the line. We have Curtis, who would like to let his voice be heard. Good morning, Curtis. Curtis, are you still there? Okay, we might have to get Curtis back on the... Curtis? Yes.
Ooh, hold on.
There you go, Curtis. Hey.
Yes.
So, yes. Now, did you have a question or a comment?
Well, yes, I can remember. Melissa, she had stole my thunder earlier, and I think she was very eloquent because she zoomed right in boldly on what the Harvard situation is. And I think behind a whole bunch, it was the false flag conjecture that went on after the 9/11, Holocaust. And it's one of those things where now that these characters like changing them and they're on their last leg out, we that's left behind, what can be done to repair the damage that was done? I mean, the global communication, all the fallout from all these here lies and all this kind of stuff. What can possibly be done because of the CIA and this, that, and the other? Of this here cross-wiring of communication where everybody's getting their information late. The president gets his information way after everybody else, and then he'd be active responding late, and people criticize him for this, that, and the other. And there's a small little faction in there that's just doing their own thing. And the damage is damaging the whole global progression of communication. And what about all the American body bags that's been coming back? And what do you tell these parents? What do you tell these people? What do you tell Americans? Taking them is the only way out. They're gone.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and so forth. What do we do to repair anything with these people that have suffered around the globe?
Yes. Yes.
Can somebody offer any suggestion on that? Because
yes, we are going to do that right now. Thank you so much for that, Curtis. If anybody else wants to let their voice be heard, the number is 212-650-6903. What he keeps saying is, where's the accountability? That's what I kept hearing, and I know Alyssa wants to jump right in.
And I think he also made another point within the accountability point, which is, how do we stand as Americans in relation to how the rest of the world looks at us now that this report has come out? And I know there was a lot of issues, which I don't really think we want to focus our conversation about whether or not the report should have been released, because I think that it should, and I think Americans have the right to know what is done in their name by their government. But there is this question of, how does the rest of the world perceive us now, and how should our military personnel be expected to be treated if they are captured, especially considering what we have done to others. But then there's the issue, the larger issue that Curtis raises regarding accountability. It's something we were just having conversation about a little bit off the air, and it's all about, and he said, when did they know, and who knew what, and when were they informed? Carlos?
Despite the fact that this report came out, there's still a lot of questions that are left unanswered.
It raises more questions than it answers to a certain extent.
I mean, look at how the director brought it out. You mentioned something about George W. Bush bringing in and saying, finding out in 2006 that... Oh, yeah,
I'll mention it on the air now.
Please, okay.
All right, so according to this report, George Bush kind of knew about this, or first began to get information about the fact that this was going on in 2006, which first raises the question of, what's going on at the CIA, and where is the, interaction between the military, the CIA, and the executive branch, right, so that people are informed and know what's going on. But then there's also a second issue, which is, assuming he's informed in 2006, which is what the report says, in 2007 he goes on to national television and he says, we don't torture people. Right. So then the question becomes, and as I said, it raises more questions than it answers. What did he know in 2006? Did they tell him about the rectal feeding?
I'm sorry, Carlos. Go ahead.
The assumption that we always bring out is that somebody in the executive branch must have known.
Somebody had to have known.
It was either Dick Cheney or Karl Rove or somebody. And the willful ignorance of George W. Bush is very telling. What you just explained is very willful ignorance from the fact that somebody in the intelligence community must have briefed the executive branch into what they were doing to a very peripheral degree.
I think it goes back to that compartmentalization that I was talking about, and I know Jason's going to jump in and speak on that. But it's like everybody's on a need-to-know basis. You don't get any more information than what you need to know, and you're only given a very little information to carry out. And that is a tactic that goes back to the Nazis. That's exactly what the SS did. They gave these people this information, and these people this information, and these people this information, so the people driving the Jews to the trains didn't know that about the people who were running the gas chambers. I mean, how much more non-accountability can you have in this situation?
That goes back to what you guys were saying about willful ignorance. I always like to use the term plausible deniability.
Right.
It's the same idea, same concept that we have this misconception in this country that the president knows everything.
Right.
He is aware of everything. But I will tell you, no one can pierce the dark mind of intelligence communities, and there's absolutely no reason to believe that they would have shared absolutely everything and the raw truth of it to the executive office just because it's the executive office. Presidents come, presidents go. It is what it is. However, whatever the mission is,
remains.
It will remain.
Yeah.
And so, of course, I'm sure the executive office was informed about what we were talking about behind the scenes, the enhanced interrogation techniques. Now, what those enhanced interrogation techniques detailed, who knows if they actually knew anything. I doubt that the level of specificity was required to explain, oh, yeah, we're doing rectal feeding. We want you to know that.
Right.
You know, and maybe even if that information was available, perhaps the executive officer said, we
Dick
really,
Cheney might have said, that's great. I like it.
Because these things are filtered. You know, these things are filtered through the president's cabinet. They're filtered through his National Security Council and National Security Advisor. Nothing gets to the president, just purely unadulterated information.
There's another point that Curtis sort of raised in his thing, which I think we're going to start to get to like at the end of the segment, but I'll just mention now, which is kind of how do we now hold these people accountable? So think about that because we're going to talk about it later. But what you just mentioned raises the point that I was raising at the very, very beginning before we started the segment during the intro about there were psychologists hired to come up with these techniques. And so there's a question of medical ethics. And then there was also lawyers hired to come up with some legal, and listen, as a lawyer, we could make a red, blue, and blue, red, and, you want me to argue something, we can figure out a way to back it up. So, there's less ethical ramifications for the lawyers to say, okay, well, we're going to pick and choose these little bits of law and we'll conjure them together and come up with some kind of memorandum, because at least it could be said that they were trying to think of some legitimate legal argument. But for the psychologists who are developing these techniques, there has to be some ethical ramifications because they're medical professionals. They're not lawyers. They're not get paid to play with words and play semantics. Selena, do we have a caller on the line that we're going to go to?
Yes, we do. Thank you so much for that, Alyssa. We do have Stefan on the line who would like to let his voice be heard. Stefan, are you there? Okay, we're going to get Stefan. Okay,
hello,
yes.
Good morning, and good morning to your panel. The first thing I would like to mention is the first line of torture I ever heard about in my life when they were experimenting on our people, meaning black people, in the Tuskegee experiments. And I just saw a documentary where President Clinton apologized to the people who were experimented on. Now, if that's not called torture, I don't know what is. And then when Bush and Obama and them claim that they don't know about the torture, they knew all along. And when they can't find people to torture them, they send them to places like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and all these other countries where everything is legalized. So what that is doing when they talk about what the American image, I've lived in other countries. I've lived in Europe. I've lived in the Caribbean. I've lived in Canada and several other countries in my life. And America has a very, very bad reputation. Most countries that I've lived in fear America. America has played itself to a point where it's downright ridiculous. And we as taxpayers, we have to pay the bill for all of this foolishness. And how it's going to affect our image, we have a bad image anyway. Our image has been tarnished for decades. So what else is new? And they're probably still torturing some brother and sister down in Rikers Island right now as we speak.
Preach on it. Thank you so much for that, Stephen, for calling in and leaving those remarks. And again, if you guys want to let your voice be heard, the number is 212-650-6903. You can also tweet us at BeHeard_radio. He brought up a number of points. I do want to just throw out one last question because I don't know where the time went, but I'm going to throw out one last question for the panel. You can get your last remarks in there as we move along. But I just want to know, so like one thing that I wanted to call us at is like, so where do we go from here and how do we hold people accountable? And I did want to bring something up because this morning on my ride here, I heard that the UK actually may have known some of this information and that they too may be, they're under the microscope right now too. Because the way I look at it, whoever knew, you're just as guilty as torturing these people. And from my perspective, again, if we don't prosecute someone, I think it's going to continue to going. Like our last caller, Stefan, just said, someone might be being tortured anywhere right now. Who knows? Because, we can talk about it, but who's really getting in trouble? Who's really feeling some type of punishment? So, again, what do you think about going from here and holding people accountable?
I'll jump in on that. I don't think there's any real way to hold anyone accountable because where does it start? Who are you going to prosecute and interrogate? I won't use the word interrogation, but who are you going to hold accountable? The actual executor of the torture, the commander, whether it be CIA or military, who oversaw the operation. How far up the ladder does it go? And even at that point, are the particular individuals who would have been culpable in this operation, is there a statute of limitations that would be applicable to this situation? It's so incredibly complex, and assigning the blame to anyone in particular, or even to any one institution, that's an impossibility. You understand? So, if anything, the greater assignment of guilt is on us as an American culture, as an American people, because if, from what I'm gathering from the panel, we knew about this, even if somewhat surreptitiously we knew about it, then it's a matter of us being complicit in it. We allowed it to happen without any public uproar. I mean, we see daily, I won't use the word uprisings, but we see daily popular protest about what went on, obviously, with Eric Garner and Michael Brown. The internet allows us to know about things at a far more expedient pace than has ever been known in human history. If we knew about it, why didn't we say anything about it?
Right. Great point,
Carlos?
Jason. Great point.
We have a very checkered history when it comes down to these things. In the 1940s, we had internment camps for the Japanese, and our courts also failed in being able to establish any kind of closure for that dark time in our history. With Korematsu v. U.S., we maintain that if there is a necessary and justifiable cause during time of war, we will act in maintaining our citizens safe from a threat. So I don't, unfortunately, and I think I'm growing incredibly cynical at this point, but I don't see any, justifiable ends in any kind of litigation or in any prosecution. I think, unfortunately, this is just going to be another dark time in the history of the United States.
And I agree with that, and I'll tell you why. The question is who's going to prosecute? I mean, the United, from a legal perspective, the United States is not a party to the International Criminal Court, and just without going through how cases get to the court, because we're not a party to the court, and because because we hold a seat on the UN Security Council, the fact of the matter is the case is not likely to be referred to the court and not likely to be prosecuted there. It's not likely to be prosecuted in U.S. courts by the Department of Justice, because we have a long history of not prosecuting politicians for policy decisions they make during time of war. There's no UN, there's going to be no UN tribunal. And, the most that I can say, and it was a really controversial article, and it was written by, believe it or not, the director of the ACLU, Rafael Romero, and he wrote in the New York Times earlier in the week that we should do preemptive pardons. And the reason why, and it's been done before, but the reason why we should do preemptive pardons is because by pardoning Dick Cheney and by pardoning the Bush administration officials and Bush himself, it acknowledges that a crime was committed. You don't get pardoned unless you commit a crime. And while, they were never convicted of any crime, there has been preemptive pardons in the past. They're basically symbolic. But by issuing a pardon, we are essentially saying you committed a crime. And we are in some ways holding them accountable in that way. But ultimately, do I ever think they'll be held accountable? prosecution-wise and go to jail? No, I don't. I don't think I do know there are other countries where there are indictments out for them, and there are places that Dick Cheney and those people cannot travel because they may be prosecuted there. Do I think they'll be prosecuted there? No, because they won't go there. So ultimately, I agree. As cynical as it is, it's a dark chapter, and my only hope is that we can read the report, we can learn about it, and that we can learn and grow in the future and not have it happen again. But unfortunately, the way history has played out, even in these situations, we find that even when we know and we know the details, I guarantee at some point in the future, there's a strong possibility, things like this will be repeated. Selena?
Right. Yeah. And lastly, just to wrap it up, there is one glimmer of hope. I think that by acknowledging our mistakes, by the President Obama releasing his statement, and a number of high-level officials also coming out and saying this is wrong, this is not American, that is definitely the first step. This is the fact that they even published this report is that's very promising, and it shows that we are going to make some type of progress. And there are people who work, who work in these different types of organizations, and they are saying that, you know what, we need to stop. So that gives me some type of optimism here. And I also think that we, like Alyssa said, we definitely need to learn from our mistakes, because how many times does this have to happen? This country was founded on torturing, killing, raping people, and it's like it just continues to happen on, and we know better now. So it's time for us to do better, and especially because it's ineffective. So, I mean, what are we really accomplishing besides our, just further tainting our reputation?
No, I agree. And just to add to that, which is that's why you had the Nuremberg trials back in the 1940s. It was to hold the people who did these atrocities accountable. And unfortunately, we're not going to see that happen here. And if you don't hold people accountable, it's likely that things will happen again.
It definitely will. But on that note, we're going to take a quick break. But don't go anywhere. When we come back, we're coming back with the news roundup, one of my favorite parts of the show. And we're going to be talking about all the craziness that happened during the week. So stay right here. This is Let Your Voice Be Heard.